Welcome to Adult Storytime at the Bedford Public Library. Glad you guys could make it. We're going to put a little holiday spin on our storytelling today. I hope you'll enjoy it. It is a story called How Christmas Came to the Santa Maria Flats. It was published in 1895. It's by a writer named Elia Peattie. It's got a copyright at 1898. So she was famous for writing children's stories. She was most famous because she was a loud voice in being a big supporter of children, children's thought, children's contributions to society. She felt like adults wrote in a style that kind of constructed a childhood realm rather than actually being authentic when it came to actually how children think, how they talk, their experiences. So she was one of the big voices in that movement. She was published in several youth magazines, the Youth Companion. That sounds familiar. Youth Companion is one of those that was sent out west to Laura Ingalls Wilder. That when she was a child, the Youth Companion. She emphasized not only the importance of knowing and preserving a child's story, but also the value of the child telling their story in their own voice. So I hope as I'm reading that I'll do a good job in reading it and you can hear what she's talking about, how she writes. She writes in the child's voice. I think she would have been a cool mom, you're right? She's so committed to. Right? That'd been fantastic. Oh, and I thought it was interesting too. She was from Kalamazoo, Michigan. She's a Midwesterner. And again, I said it was published in 1895. Okay. How Christmas Came to the Santa Maria Flats by Elia Peattie. There were 26 flat children, and none of them had ever been flat children until that year. Previously, they had all been home children, and as such had, of course, had beautiful Christmases in which their relations with Santa Claus had been of the most intimate and personal nature. Now, owing to their residence in the Santa Maria Flats and the lease, all was changed. The lease was a strange forbiddance, an ukase issued by a tyrant, which took from children their natural liberties and rights. Though to be sure, as every one of the flat children knew, they were in the greatest kind of luck to be allowed to live at all, and especially were they fortunate past the lot of children to be permitted to live in a flat. There were many flats in the great city, so polished and carved and burnished and belacquered that children were not allowed to enter within the portals, save on visits of ceremony in charge of parents or governesses. And in one flat, where Cecil de Koven LeBaron was born, just by accident and without intending any harm, he was evicted, along with his parents, by the time he reached the age where he seemed likely to be graduated from the go-kart, and yet that flat had not nearly so imposing a name as the Santa Maria. The 26 children of the Santa Maria Flats belonged to 20 families. All of these 20 families were peculiar, as you might learn any day by interviewing the families concerning one another. But they bore with each other's peculiarities quite cheerfully and spoke in the hall when they met. Sometimes this tolerance would even extend to conversation about the janitor, a thin creature who did the work of 5 men. And the ladies complained that he never smiled. I wouldn't so much mind the hot water pipes leaking now and then, the ladies would remark in the vestibule, rustling their skirts to show that they wore silk petticoats. If only the janitor would smile. But he looks like a cemetery. Oh, I know it, would be the response. I told Mr. Wilberforce last night that if he would only get a cheerful janitor, I wouldn't mind our having rubber instead of Axminster on the stairs. You know, we were promised Axminster when we moved in, would be the plaintive response, and the ladies would stand together for a moment wrapped in gloomy reflection and then part. The kitchen and nursemaids felt on the same subject too. If Carl Carlson would only smile, they used to exclaim in sibilant whispers as they passed on the way to the laundry. If he'd come in and joke while we was washing. Only Kara Johnson never said anything on the subject because she knew why Carlson didn't smile and was sorry for it, and would have made it all right if it hadn't been for Lars Larson. Dear, dear, but this is a digression from the subject of the lease. That terrible document was held over the heads of the children, as the Herodian pronunciamento concerning small boys was over the heads of the Israelites. It was in the lease not to run, not to jump, not to yell. It was in the lease not to sing in the halls, not to call from story to story, not to slide down the banisters. And there were blocks of banisters so smooth and wide and beautiful that the attraction between them and the seats of the little boy's trousers was like the attraction of a magnet for a nail. Yet not a leg, crooked or straight, fat or thin, was ever to be thrown over those polished surfaces. It was in the lease, too, that no peddler or agent or suspicious stranger was to enter the Santa Maria, neither by the front door nor the back door. The janitor stood in his uniform at the rear, and the lackey in his uniform at the front, to prevent any such intrusion upon the privacy of the aristocratic Santa Marias. The lackey who politely directed people and summoned elevators and whistled up tubes and rang bells, thus conducting the complex social life of those favored apartments, was not one to make a mistake and admit any person not calculated to ornament the front parlors of the flatters. It was this that worried the children, for how could such a dear, disorderly, democratic rascal as the children's saint ever hope to gain a pass to that exclusive entrance and get up to the rooms of the flat children? For how could, you can see for yourself, said Ernest, who lived on the first floor, to Roderick, who lived on the fourth, that if Santa Claus can't get up the front stairs and he can't get up the back stairs, that all he can do is to come down the chimney. And he can't come down the chimney. At least he can't come out of our fireplace. Why not? Asked Roderick, who was busy with an all-day sucker and not inclined to take a gloomy view of anything. Oh, goosey, cried Ernest in great disdain. I'll show you. And he led Roderick with his sucker right into the best parlor where the fireplace was and showed him an awful thing. Of course, to the ordinary observer, there was nothing awful about the fireplace. Everything in the way of a bric-a-brac possessed by the Santa Maria Flatters was artistic. May have been in the lease that only people with aesthetic tastes were to be admitted to the apartments. However that may be, the fireplace with its vases and pictures and trinkets was something quite wonderful. Indian incense burned in a mysterious little dish. Pictures of purple ladies were hung in odd corners, and calendars and letters nobody could read served to decorate, if not educate, and glass vases of strange colors and extraordinary shapes stood about, filled with roses. None of these things were awful. At least no one would have dared say they were. But what was awful was the formation of the grate. It was not a hospitable place with andirons where noble logs of wood could be laid for the burning, nor did it have a generous iron basket where honest anthracite could glow away into the nights. Not a bit of it. It had a vertical plate of stuff that looked like dirty cotton wool on which a tiny blue flame leaped when the gas was turned on and ignited. See, you could see for yourself, said Ernest tragically. Roger could see for himself. There was an inch-wide opening down which the friend of the children could squeeze himself. And as everybody knows, he needs a good deal of room now, for he has grown portly with age, and his pack every year becomes bigger owing to the ever-increasing numbers of boys and girls he has to supply. Jiminy, said Roderick, and dropped all his all-day sucker on the old Bokhara rug that Ernest's mamma had bought that week before at a fashionable furnishing shop, which had given the sore throat to all the family owing to some cunning little germ that had come over with the rug to see what American throats were like. Oh, me, yes, but Roderick could see, anybody could see, and a boy could see better than anybody. Oh, let's go see the telephone boy, said Roderick. This seemed the wisest thing to do. When in doubt, all the children went to the telephone boy, who was the most fascinating person. with knowledge of the most wonderful kind, and of a nature to throw that of Mrs. Scheherazade quite in the shade, which, considering how long the loquacious lady had been a shade, is perhaps not surprising. The telephone boy knew the answers to all the conundrums in the world, and a way out of nearly all troubles such as are likely to overtake boys and girls. But now he had no suggestions to offer and could not speak any comfortable words. He can get her done front, and he can't get her done to back, and he can't come down no chimney in this here house, and I'll tell you dose, he said, and shut his mouth grimly, while cold apprehension crept around Ernest's heart and took the sweetness out of Roderick's succor. Nevertheless, hope springs eternal, and the boys each and individually asked their fathers, tremendously wise and good men, if they thought there was any hope that Santa Claus would get into the Santa Maria Flats. And each of the fathers looked up from his paper and said, he'd be blessed if he did. And the words sunk deep and drew the tears when the doors were closed and the soft black was all about, and nobody could laugh because a boy was found crying. And the girls cried too, for the awful news was whistled up tubes and whistled down tubes till all the 26 flat children knew about it. The next day it was talked over in the brick court, where the children used to go to shout and race. But on this day there was neither shouting nor racing. There was instead a shaking of heads, a superstitious dropping of tears, a guessing and protesting and lamenting. All the flat mothers congratulated themselves on the fact that their children were becoming so quiet and orderly, and wondered what could have come over them when they noted that they neglected to run after the patrol wagon as it whizzed around the block. It was decided, after a solemn talk, that every child should go to its own fireplace and investigate. In the event of any fireplace being found with an opening big enough to admit Santa Claus, a note could be left directing him along the halls to the other apartments. A spirit of universal brotherhood had taken possession of the Santa Maria Flatters. Misery bound them together, but the investigation proved to be disheartening, and the cruel asbestos grates were everywhere, and hope lay strangled. As time went on, melancholy settled upon the flat children. The parents noted it and wondered if there could be sewer gases in the apartments. One over-anxious mother called in a physician, who gave the poor little child some medicine which made it quite ill. No one suspected the truth, though the children were often heard to say that it was evident that there was to be no Christmas for them. But then, what more natural for a child to say, thus hoping to win protestations? So the mothers reasoned and let the remark pass. The day before Christmas was gray and dismal. There were no winds. Indeed, there was a sort of tightness in the air, as if the supply of freshness had given out. People had headaches. Even the telephone boy was cross, and none of the spirit of the time appeared to enliven the flat children. There appeared to be no stir, no mystery, no whisperings went on in the corners, or at least so it seemed to the sad babies of the Santa Maria. "It is as plain as a monkey on a hand organ," said the telephone boy to the attendants at his salon in the basement, "that there ain't to be no Christmas for we. Nope, not for we." Had not Dorothy produced at this junction from the folds of her fluffy silken skirts several substantial sticks of gum, there is no saying to what depths of discouragement the flat children would have fallen. About 6 o'clock, it seemed as if the children would smother for lack of air. It was very peculiar. Even the janitor noticed it. He spoke about it to Kara at the head of the back stairs, and she held her hand so as to let him see the new silver ring on her fourth finger. And he let go of the rope on the elevator in which he was standing and dropped to the bottom of the shaft, so that Kara sent up a wild halloo of alarm. But the janitor emerged as melancholy and unruffled as ever, only looking at his watch to see if it had been stopped by the concussion. The telephone boy, who usually got a bit of something hot sent down to him for one of the tables, owing to the fact that he never ate any meal save breakfast at home, was quite forgotten on this day, and dined off 2 russet apples and drew up his belt to stop the ache, for the telephone boy was growing very fast indeed, in spite of his poverty, and couldn't seem to stop growing somehow, although he said to himself every day that it was perfectly brutal of him to keep on that way when his mother had so many mouths to feed. Well, the tightness of the air got worse. Everyone was as cross at dinner, complained of feeling tired afterward and of wanting to just go to bed. For all of that, it was not to get to sleep, and the children tossed and tumbled for a long time before they put their little hands in the big, soft, shadowy clasp of the Sandman and trooped away after him to the happy town asleep. Well, it seemed to the Flat children that they had been asleep but a few moments when there came a terrible burst of wind and shook even that great house to its foundations. Actually, as they sat up in bed and called to their parents or their nurses, their voices seemed smothered with the roar. Could it be that the wind was a great wild beast with 100 tongues which licked at the roof of the building? And how many voices must it have to bellow as it did? Sounds of falling glass, of breaking shutters, of crashing chimneys greeted their ears. Not that they knew what all these sounds meant. They only knew that it seemed as if the end of the world had come. And Ernest, miserable as he was, wondered if the telephone boy had gotten safely home, or if he were alone in that draughty room in the basement. And Roderick hugged his big brother, who slept with him, and said, "Now I lay me 3 times running, as fast as ever his tongue would say it." After a terrible time, the wind settled down into a steady howl like a hungry wolf, and the children went to sleep, worn out with fright, and conscious that the bedclothes could not keep out the cold. Dawn came, and the children awoke shivering, and they sat up in bed and looked about them. Yes, they did, the whole 26 of them in their different apartments and their different homes, and what do you suppose they saw? What do you suppose the 26 Flat children saw as they looked about them? Why, stockings stuffed full, and trees hung full, and boxes packed full. Yes, they did. It was Christmas morning, and the bells were ringing, and all the little Flat children were laughing, for Santa Claus had come. He had already really come, in the wind and wild weather, while the tongues of the wind licked hungrily at the roof, while the wind howled like a hungry wolf. He had crept in somehow, and laughing, no doubt, and chuckling without question, he had filled the stockings and the trees and the boxes. Dear me, but it was a happy time. It makes me out of breath to think what a happy time it was, and how surprised the Flat children were, and how they wondered how it could ever have happened. But they found out, of course. It happened in the simplest way. Every skylight in the place was blown off and away, and that was how the wind howled so, and how the bedclothes would not keep the children warm, and how Santa Claus had got in. The wind corkscrewed down into these holes, and the reckless children with their drums and dolls and their guns and toy dishes danced around in the maelstrom and sang, "Here's where Santa Claus came. This is how he got in. We should count it a sin, yes, count it a shame, if it hurt him when he fell on the floor." Roderick's sister was clever for her age. She'd read Monte Cristo 10 times, though she was only 11. She wrote this poem, which everyone thought very fine. And of course, all the parents thought and said what Santa Claus must have jumped down the skylights. By noon, there were other skylights put in, and not a sign left of the way he had made his entrance. Not that the way mattered a bit. No, not a bit. Perhaps you think the telephone boy didn't get anything. Maybe you imagine that Santa Claus didn't get down that far, but you're mistaken. The shaft below one of the skylights went way to the bottom of the building, and it stands to reason that the old fellow must have fallen way through. At any rate, there was a copy of Tom Sawyer, a whole plum pudding, and a number of other things more useful but not very interesting, found down in the chilly basement room. There were indeed. In closing, it is only proper to mention that Kara Johnson crocheted a white silk 4-in-hand necktie for Carl Carson, the janitor, and the janitor actually smiled. And that is how Christmas came to the Santa Maria Flats. That is the end of this one. I have one more if you want to, don't mind me reading that one. It is a folk tale. It is also around the same time period as Elia's, but this one is actually by Mary Wilkins Freeman, and it's called Jimmy's Scarecrow's Christmas. It is also a short one. Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas.
Scarecrow.
Jimmy Scarecrow. Okay. Let's try this one. Jimmy Scarecrow led a sad life in the winter. Jimmy's greatest grief was his lack of occupation. He liked to be useful, and in winter he was absolutely of no use at all. He wondered how many such miserable winters he would have to endure. He was a young scarecrow, and this was his first one. He was strongly made, and although his wooden joints creaked a little when the wind blew, he did not grow in the least rickety. And every morning when the wintry sun peered like a hard yellow eye across the dry corn stubble, Jimmy felt sad. But at Christmas time his heart nearly broke. On Christmas Eve, Santa Claus came in his sledge, heaped high with presents, urging his team of reindeer across the field. He was on his way to the farmhouse where Betsy lived with her Aunt Hannah. Betsy was a very good little girl with very smooth yellow curls, and she had a great many presents. Santa Claus had a large wax doll baby for her on his arm, tucked up against the fur collar of his coat. He was afraid to trust it in the pack lest it get broken. When poor Jimmy Scarecrow saw Santa Claus, his heart gave a great leap. "Santa Claus, here I am," he cried out. But Santa Claus did not hear him. "Santa Claus, please give me a little present. I was good all summer and kept the crows out of the corn," pleaded the poor Scarecrow in his choking voice. But Santa Claus passed by with a merry halloo and a great clamor of bells. Then Jimmy Scarecrow stood in the corn stubble and shook with sobs until his joints creaked. "I am of no use in the world, and everybody has forgotten me," he moaned. But he was mistaken. The next morning, Betsy sat at the window holding her Christmas doll baby, and she looked out at Jimmy Scarecrow standing alone in the field amidst the corn stubble. "Aunt Hannah," said she. Aunt Hannah was making a crazy patch quilt. She frowned hard at a triangular piece of red silk and circular piece of pink, wondering how to fit them together. "Well," said she, "did Santa Claus bring the Scarecrow any Christmas presents?" "Well, no, of course he didn't." "Well, why not?" "Because he's a scarecrow. Don't ask silly questions." "I wouldn't like to be treated so if I was a scarecrow," said Betsy. But her Aunt Hannah did not hear her. She was busy cutting a triangular snip out of the round piece of pink silk so that the piece of red silk could be feather stitched into it. It was snowing hard out of doors, and the north wind blew, and the Scarecrow's poor old coat got wider and wider with snow, and sometimes he almost vanished in the thick white storm. And Aunt Hannah worked until the middle of the afternoon on her crazy quilt, and then she got up, spread it out over the sofa with an air of pride. "Now there," she said, "that's done, and that makes the 8th. I've got one for every bed in the house, and I've given 4 away. I'd given this one if I knew of anybody that wanted it." Aunt Hannah put on her hood and shawl and drew some blue yarn stockings on over her shoes and sat out through the snow to carry a slice of plum pudding to her sister Susan, who lived down the road. Half an hour after Aunt Hannah had gone, Betsy put her little red plaid shawl over her head and ran across the field to Jimmy Scarecrow. She carried her new doll baby snuggled up under her shawl. "Wish you a Merry Christmas," she said to Jimmy Scarecrow. "Wish you the same," said Jimmy, but his voice was choked with sobs and was also muffled, for his old hat had slipped down to his chin. And Betsy looked pitifully at the old hat fringed with icicles, like frozen tears, and the old snow-laden coat. "I've brought you a Christmas present," she said, and with that she tucked her doll baby inside Jimmy Scarecrow's coat, sticking its tiny feet into a pocket. "Oh, thank you," said Jimmy Scarecrow faintly. "You're welcome," she said. "Keep her under your overcoats. The snow won't get her wet, and she won't catch cold. She's delicate." "Yes, I will," said Jimmy Scarecrow, and he tried hard to bring one of his stiff, outstretched arms around to clasp the doll baby. "Don't you feel cold in that old summer coat?" asked Betsy. "If I had a little exercise, I should be warm," he replied. But he shivered, and the wind whistled through his rags. "Will you wait a minute?" said Betsy, and she was off across the field. And Jimmy Scarecrow stood in the corn stubble with the doll baby under his coat and waited, and soon Betsy was back again with Aunt Hannah's crazy quilt trailing in the snow behind her. "Here," she said. "Here is something to keep you warm," and she folded the crazy quilt around the Scarecrow and pinned it. "Aunt Hannah wants to give it away if anybody wants it," she explained. She's got so many crazy quilts in the house now she doesn't even know what to do with them. Goodbye. Be sure you keep the doll baby covered up. And with that, she ran across the field and left Jimmy Scarecrow alone with the crazy quilt and the doll baby. The bright flash of colors under Jimmy's hat brim dazzled his eyes, and he felt a little alarmed. I hope this quilt is harmless if it is crazy, he said. But the quilt was warm, and he dismissed his fears, and soon the doll baby whimpered. But he creaked his joints a little, and that amused it, and he heard it cooing inside his coat. Jimmy Scarecrow had never felt so happy in his life as he did for an hour or so. But after that, the snow began to turn to rain, and the crazy quilt was soaked through. Not only that, but his coat, and the poor doll baby. It cried pitifully for a while, and then it was still, and he was so afraid that it was dead. It grew very dark, and the rain fell in sheets, and the snow melted, and Jimmy Scarecrow stood halfway up his old boots in water. He was saying to himself that the saddest hour of his life had come, when suddenly he again heard Santa Claus's sleigh bells, and his merry voice talking to his reindeer. It was after midnight. Christmas was over, and Santa was hastening home to the North Pole. Santa Claus, dear Santa Claus, cried Jimmy Scarecrow with a great sob, and that time Santa Claus heard him and drew rein. Who's there? He shouted out of the darkness. It's only me, replied the Scarecrow. Who's me? Shouted Santa Claus. It's Jimmy Scarecrow. Santa got out of his sledge and waded up. Have you been standing here ever since the corn was ripe? He asked pityingly, and Jimmy replied that he had. What's that over your shoulders? Santa continued, holding up his lantern. It's a crazy quilt. What are you holding under your coat? The doll baby that Betsy gave me, and I'm afraid it's dead, poor Jimmy Scarecrow sobbed. Oh, nonsense, cried Santa Claus. Let me see it. And with that, he pulled the doll baby out from under the Scarecrow's coat and patted its back and shook it a little. It began to cry and then to crow. It's all right, said Santa Claus. This is the doll baby I gave Betsy, and it's not at all delicate. It went through the measles and the chicken pox and the mumps and the whooping cough before it left the North Pole. Now get in the sledge, Jimmy, and bring the doll baby and the crazy quilt. I've never had any quilts that weren't in their right minds at the North Pole, but maybe I can cure this one. Get in, Santa chirped to his reindeer, and they drew the sledge up close in a beautiful curve. Get in, Jimmy Scarecrow, and come with me to the North Pole, he cried. Please, how long shall I stay? Asked Jimmy. Why, you're going to live with me, said Santa Claus. I've been looking for a person like you for a long time. Are there any crows to scare away at the North Pole? I want to be useful, said Jimmy. No, answered Santa Claus. But I don't want you to scare away crows. I want you to scare away Arctic explorers. I could keep you in work for 1,000 years. Scaring away Arctic explorers from the North Pole is much more important than scaring away crows from the corn. Why, if they found the pole, there wouldn't be a piece an inch long left in a week's time, and the earth would cave in like an apple without a core. They would whittle it all to pieces and carry it away in their pockets for souvenirs. Now come along, I'm in a hurry. I will go on 2 conditions, said Jimmy. First, I want to make a present for Aunt Hannah and Betsy next Christmas. You shall make them any present you choose. What else? I want some way provided to scare the crows out of the corn next summer while I am away, said Jimmy. Well, that's easily managed, said Santa Claus. Just wait a minute. Santa took his stylographic pen out of his pocket, went with his lantern close to one of his fence posts, and wrote these words upon it. Notice to crows. Whichever crow shall hereafter hop, fly, or flop in this field during the absence of Jimmy Scarecrow, the therefrom purloined steel and or abstract corn shall be instantly in a twinkling and a trace turn snow white and be ever after a disgrace, a byword and a reproach to his whole race, per order of Santa Claus. Well, the corn will be safe now, said Santa Claus. Get in. And Jimmy got into the sledge, and they flew away over the fields out of sight with merry halloos and a great clamor of bells. The next morning, there was much surprise at the farmhouse. When Aunt Hannah and Betsy looked out of the window and the Scarecrow was not in the field holding out his stiff arms above the corn stubble, Betsy had told Aunt Hannah she had given away the crazy quilt and the doll baby, but had been scolded very little. You must not give away anything of yours again without asking permission, said Aunt Hannah, and you have no right to give anything of mine, even if you know I don't want it. Now both my pretty quilt and your beautiful doll baby are spoiled. That was all Aunt Hannah had said. She thought she would send John after the quilt and the doll baby next morning as soon as it was light. But Jimmy Scarecrow was gone, and the crazy quilt and the doll baby with him. John, the servant man, searched everywhere, but not a trace of them could he find. They must have all blown away, Mum, he said to Aunt Hannah. We shall have to have another scarecrow next summer, said she. But the next summer there was no need of a scarecrow, for not a crow came past the fence post on which Santa Claus had written his notice to the crows. The cornfield was never so beautiful, and not a single grain was stolen by a crow, and everybody wondered at it, for they could not read the crow language in which Santa had written. It is a great mystery to me why the crows don't come into our cornfield when there is no scarecrow, said Aunt Hannah. But she had still a greater mystery to solve when Christmas came around again, and that she and Betsy had each a strange present. They found them in the sitting room on Christmas morning. Aunt Hannah's present was her old crazy quilt remodeled, with every piece cut square and true and matched exactly to its neighbor. Why, it's my old crazy quilt, but it isn't crazy now, cried Aunt Hannah, with her very spectacles seemed to glisten with amazement. Betsy's present was her doll baby of the Christmas before, but the doll was a year older. She had grown an inch and walked and said mama and how do. She was changed a good deal, but Betsy knew her at once. It's my doll baby, she cried, and snatched her up and kissed her. But neither Aunt Hannah nor Betsy ever knew that the quilt and the doll were Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas presents to them.
That's an odd story.
Isn't that different? Around the same time.
Yeah.
Around the same time.